So I'm going to make a video that I expect will be a bit more controversial than normal. Most people consider topics like prohibition and abortion to be controversial topics, but this video is going to be an experiment, mainly because I would like to be able to just speak honestly and not have to sugarcoat what I say or water it down. I want to make a video where it's totally transparent and you see the real deal, so I'm going to make a video like that and see how people react. And I know some people won't be comfortable with that, and I know that some people will disagree with my methods, but hey, if it's not something you're comfortable with, you don't have to watch it. So this video will basically be about how I would have managed Iraq. The Iraq occupation, the invasion, moving Saddam Hussein out of power, so on and so forth. And this isn't a case of hindsight decisions using information we have post-invasion and wouldn't have had 10 years ago. I held a similar position back in '04. Now, in the United States, Saddam Hussein, that's the name of the former dictator of Iraq, is a household name. Pretty much everyone knows who he is. And I find myself wondering, how might things be different if it was handled differently? Because I don't agree with the way it was handled, but you'll see that's soon enough. So putting myself in Bush's shoes, well, actually Clinton's shoes, because this should have been dealt with in the 90s, let's wind the clocks back a couple decades. The Gulf War ended, it's 1992, the USA left Iraq not too long ago. Now, at the time, we left Iraq, but there were conditions. We wanted Hussein to do some stuff. Now, later, skipping ahead a decade, Bush Jr. is in office, and in the USA we have this big media fuss about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And this was mainly used as a buzzword to justify getting people on board with an invasion, because at the time the majority of Americans supported invading Iraq. But the majority were also led to believe that Saddam was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction. In truth, we didn't need WMDs to justify an invasion. Saddam had violated his contract. WMDs were just used to sell sensationalism. It was a buzzword to convince the public that an invasion was actually necessary. As a result, nowadays people use, he didn't have WMDs, as if it were a valid point, but really, WMDs weren't all that important apart from their buzzword value. Let's ignore the fact that he had WMDs in the first place before the Gulf War because the USA gave them to him, but I'll get back to that later. In my opinion, the whole thing was systemically flawed from the start. I would have never invaded Iraq, and I had the same problem with it a decade ago. If Saddam was a legitimate problem, which he was, but not because of WMDs, I would have dealt with him differently. For the record, I still think that this should have been addressed in the 90s, but here's the way it would have gone down in the Bush Jr. era. In a nutshell, I'd have done it Eisenhower style. I've just been elected the President of the United States. I'm getting gray hairs from being the President, and I'm drinking an unhealthy amount of coffee to read my 7-inch stack of paperwork in the morning. And I read an update from the CIA telling me, let's pick something out of a hat. Let's say it's about Saddam building palaces while a lot of his people are starving. It doesn't have to be WMDs, or let's humor it. Let's say the report actually said he was gathering materials for weapons of mass destruction. Doesn't really matter, though. I'm not going to play games with him. I'm not going to try to get the UN to yell at him. I'm not going to call him and warn him. I'm not going to issue a trade embargo or say that the USA will stop buying his oil. No, none of that. I see the report on my desk, and I make arrangements. I'm not going to call him and ask him to behave, I'm just going to make arrangements. It's back to the 1950s, we're doing it Eisenhower style. It's going to be just past midnight in his time zone, and a bunch of men wearing black that he can't see the faces of are going to put a bag over his head, and he's going to wake up in a holding cell in the United States. Then he will be told that he's had a bomb surgically implanted in his body, and it's on perpetual countdown. And if the countdown is not reset every couple of minutes, if my people stop resetting it, the bomb detonates. He'll be informed that the bomb is wired to explode if any sort of interference takes place, such as electromagnetic interference. He will be informed that microphones and cameras have been implanted in his body, and if he makes any attempt to remove them or the bomb, he will be killed. He will be informed that he will be under 24-hour surveillance, and his every action will be watched. And really, this should have been taken care of by Bush Sr. We should have put a bomb in his chest at the end of the Gulf War. That's actually one of the reasons he built so many palaces. One of Saddam's little quirks was that he built a lot of palaces and had meals cooked for him at each, even when he wasn't there. And people in the West hear about that, and most think, oh, he was so greedy and self-indulgent, his people were starving, blah blah blah. Well, actually, there's a valid reason for doing that. It makes it a lot harder for someone to assassinate him. Think about it. If you have 20 palaces and meals prepared at each, and your enemy wants you assassinated, he has to hit all 20 at once to get you if he doesn't know which one you'll be at. If you have just one palace, or only have meals cooked at one at a time, you may as well broadcast your location. Unless, of course, you just use decoys to the palaces, and just don't try to live quite as lavishly, but that's a different topic. And really, he should have been managed at the end of the Gulf War, or at least when he started making preparations to invade the United States. And this is a pet peeve I have with the American government. They seem to be under the impression that the best way to take someone into custody is to give them several weeks advance notice via media announcement that we'll start hunting them soon, making it blindingly obvious when we'll be coming for them, and giving them time to go into hiding. We announce in the news and media who our suspect is weeks or months before we actually go to get them, and the assumption seems to be that our enemies don't have access to stuff we broadcast on the public news. I disagree. There's going to be no media announcement, no public broadcasts, no UN sanctions, no issuing a warning, no threatening to stop buying oil, no. I'll have him kidnapped or assassinated and replaced with someone more compliant. Saddam Hussein would never have been made a household name because I never would have announced publicly that he was doing something wrong. I find out he wasn't behaving, and he gets kidnapped. I tell him I'll kill him and replace him with someone else if he refuses to behave. I tell him he's got a bomb and microphones and cameras implanted in his body, and that's the end of it. It doesn't need to get any more complicated than that. And people in the USA like to think that kidnappings and assassinations are actually difficult, but really, it's not for a nation with the resources of the USA. People only believe that because the USA has had an extremely difficult time with it in recent years, and it's easier for people to believe that it's difficult rather than accept that the American government fucked it up by tipping off our enemies that they had become targets, and that they themselves fucked it up by sanctioning that method with public opinion and enabling that failed strategy as a valid political move. Another requirement to hold the belief that assassinations are difficult is to forget about the large number of times we adjusted a nation's government in the pre-Vietnam era. Since we're actually responsible for putting a lot of these dictators into power, it's very easy to get people to conveniently forget about those assassinations and kidnappings too. It's another case where people choose a delusion over reality because the delusion is more comfortable. In recent decades, the instant we decide we want someone dead, we slap a massive bounty on their head and announce it to the whole world. You remember Jabba the Hutt's scene from Star Wars Episode 4 where he tells Han Solo that he'll put a bounty on his head so large he won't be able to go near a civilized system? Yeah, same idea. You can evade capture, but you can't go anywhere civilized and can't use any technology. And that's basically the state we put Osama and Saddam in. It's a great way to render someone inactive, but it's not good if you want to actually establish control over the situation and put someone who will conform to your agenda in power. And people also seem to think that these dictators exist in limited quantities, when in reality, they're entirely disposable. And this reminds me of the Kony 2012 video. It went viral, everyone spread it around, a few cynical people like me got flamed to all hell for the first week, and then no one wanted to talk about it anymore because they were embarrassed at their stupidity. But when I made a video about the Kony 2012 video, one of my major criticisms was that the entire 30-minute video didn't address what happens after you kill someone, and often the dictator is replaced. So I'm going to go back to the old system where we adjust a nation's government. We don't need to parade our military around in foreign countries, and we don't need to make a big media storm. No one appreciates subtlety anymore, or just being a little bit humble. Is that really so much to ask for? These matters would have been dealt with subtly and quietly. We'd keep tabs on what's going on in the rest of the world, and if something becomes a problem, we'll take care of it quietly. And yeah, I would have given Saddam WMDs if I concluded it fit my agenda. The reason the USA gave him WMDs was so he could fight with Iran, and the two could just fight amongst themselves and never really accomplish anything. I do suspect that I may have been more difficult to persuade that giving him WMDs was necessary, but if I was convinced, I'd do so. But sooner or later, he's going to outlive his usefulness, and when that time comes, it's time to replace him or make him more motivated to behave. We don't need a big media fuss, and we certainly didn't need a formal military invasion. And here's how my agenda would work. We kidnap him and I tell him, let's take some time out of our daily lives to sit down and have a little chat. I don't really like the way you've been running your country. There are some things that could use improvement, and I'm not going to be insensitive to your position. I know things don't change overnight, but maybe build some hospitals and schools once in a while and try to address the starvation issues, and maybe, don't keep executing your own citizens without trial or testing your bioweapons on them. I'm not asking you to turn your country into a utopia by the end of the next month. I know that's unreasonable, but I expect to see some level of performance out of you. And if I think you're holding back on me, the bomb in your chest will go off, and your replacement will take charge. That's an inconvenience for me, so I'd appreciate it if it were not necessary. Oh, and by the way, you're going to give us some oil shipments regularly. It takes a lot of money to run these operations, and keeping you under 24-hour surveillance and keeping track of the developments in your country in an organized manner, that's expensive. My government employees have mouths to feed, and you're going to be paying for it. And I want you to remember that if you ever think about crossing me. Remember that you're paying for all this, and we're not going to suddenly stop watching you 5 years from now from budget cuts. I'd appreciate it if we could depend on your cooperation, because I'm not particularly motivated to kill you, but if you cross me, you'll die in agony moments later. Now, we'll send you back to your country, back to your position of power, and we'll see where you are in a couple months. Have a nice day. And that'd be the end of it. No need for a media fuss, no need to do a full-scale invasion. Formal military action is for when subtlety isn't effective. And even then, I probably wouldn't have stayed for very long. And basically, that's what I would have done. Now, with that said, there is one large difference, and that's that Eisenhower's objective was to set up governments to block the spread of communism. Since I don't really have that goal, it's probable that I wouldn't adjust a nation's government very frequently. I am a meritocrat and therefore don't believe in communism or in democracy or in anything. My alignment is to the system of government that proves itself to be the best, so I look at the United States the same way I look at North Korea. I view both as social experiments on a large scale. I think North Korea is a larger failure, but my opinions on North Korea are a topic for a future video. I'd prefer to see how a nation turns out rather than to adjust it by force. But that's not out of some benevolence on my part or some desire to respect the sovereignty of others. It's because I view systems of government as social experiments, and I have something to gain from observing their success or failure. I'd probably only adjust a government when I have something to gain from doing so. Now, normally at this point, the people who don't like my methods try to provide a counter-argument. As of this point, I've never been given one that did not depend on moral reasons or fabricated reasons. People like to think that, oh, the UN would stop you. Really, the UN's going to stop the United States from doing something, like how the UN does something about all the other problems that this world has. Yeah, that's like standing in a street where 20 people are being murdered, and when one of the larger and stronger guys decides to beat on someone with a baseball bat, even if it's provoked, you go to him and tell him, the police will stop you. They're not doing anything about the other 20 people, and this one in particular has more power. On what basis is the UN going to get involved? The fact of the matter is that the only currency in this world is power. You can use money as a proxy, but ultimately, it's power. You can fabricate a moral reason saying you don't like my solution, but frankly, we live on planet Earth, not planet our personal morality, and the world is a bad place. The question is not who will let me, but who will stop me, and that's the way the world works. All the justification I really need is that I have the power to do it. I could turn around and tell Saddam Hussein to test some new American bioweapons for me. I'm choosing not to. And people don't want to accept that. People seem to want to believe that morality is the ruler of the world and that the good guys always win. Now, there's an elementary school within walking distance of my house. I could walk onto that campus and conduct a school shooting. It has no guards or security or surveillance, and pretty much any average person can have the power to do this. It's just, I didn't wake up this morning and decide, I'd really like to shoot some kids today. Our school shootings would be a lot higher if more people actually wanted to do them. People seem to treat the law like it's a deity and forget that the main way the law works is by discouraging actions due to the consequences. It's like the law has a magic aura that works as repellent to people who might be thinking about conducting a school shooting. That's not my personal choice to avoid killing some kids today, but that a deity of sorts is forcing me and makes me unable to do it, and that most of the time the law is successful. No, I choose not to grab my kitchen knife and go stab my next-door neighbor. It is a choice that I have made as an individual, and the law, this idol of worship, has no ability to stop me. They may have some ability to manage the situation after the fact if I'm unusually sloppy with how I deal with a body, but that's really the extent of it. It's a false messiah. So if you're going to criticize my position, I request that you have something better than a concept of good and evil, because an empty platitude about it being wrong isn't enough for me. I need something more real than that. Anyway, there's a nice, honest video. I'm curious what people's reaction will be. I'll see you next time.